The minions were faced with a dire emergency. Gru needed a paperclip, but for some reason they couldn't get one. Being the incompetent buffoons that they are, things went awry when Kevin attempted to use a banana peel to glide across the room and grab the shiny fastener from a nearby desk. Stuart attempted to use a catapult to fire a minion towards the paperclip, except he miscalculated the trajectory, and the minion ended up stuck on the ceiling. Bob tried using a pogo stick to reach the paperclip, but instead launched himself into a nearby filing cabinet. And when Dave attempted to simply walk over and grab it, he got his foot stuck in a stapler and ended up face down on the floor. All of them were completely defeated, except for one. One minion stood out amongst the rest. This minion had a look of steely-eyed determination on his face. He was covered head to toe in soot and his clothes were torn and tattered. In his hand, he held a large magnifying glass, which he used to focus the sun's rays onto a small pile of twigs and leaves. With a determined grunt, he stirred the twigs and leaves into a small fire. Taking a deep breath, he knelt down next to the fire and pulled a small metal box out of his pocket. With trembling hands, he opened the box and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Using a stubby pencil, he began writing on the paper. After a few moments, he unfolded the paper, read what was written on it, and then smiled. The fire crackled merrily as the minions began to cheer. The single sheet of paper that the determined minion had pulled out of his box was no ordinary piece of paper. It was a grocery list, and on that grocery list was one very important item: paper clips. Now, many of you may be thinking, well, why didn't they just go to the store? Well, you're probably forgetting that this is a story about minions. If it were that easy, they wouldn't be standing around a pathetic little fire trying to figure out how to get a piece of paper. And let's be real, none of them have phones or money or any other means of paying for groceries. Besides, if they did go to the store, they would end up starting some kind of riot and getting arrested. So no, standing around a fire in the middle of their base writing grocery lists was definitely the best option they had. The minions cheered for several minutes until their leader, Kevin, put his hand up in the air to quiet them down. All right, settle down everyone, he said. We need to figure out who's going to the store. All eyes turned to Bob, who had just emerged from the filing cabinet with a bandage wrapped around his foot. You, Kevin said, pointing at him. You're going to the store. Bob looked down at his foot and then back at Kevin and shook his head. Bob, you're the smallest minion there, said Kevin. It'll be easiest for you to sneak into the store without being noticed. But my foot, whimpered Bob. Don't worry about your foot, interrupted Dave. I already got you a present. Dave reached into his pocket and pulled out a brand new pair of crutches. Ooh, said Bob. Thank you, Dave, and so Bob set off for the store, hobbling on his crutches. As soon as he stepped outside, however, the wind snatched the crutches right out of his hands and sent them flying down the street. Bob stared after his crutches in disbelief. A small smile crept onto his face and he began to giggle uncontrollably. The sight of a giggling, hopping Bob was too much for the other minions to bear. They burst out laughing. Even Gru couldn't help but crack a smile. This is going to be a long day, he muttered to himself. Meanwhile, Bob was making his way to the store. He shuffled slowly through the automatic doors and inside. He found himself in the frozen food section. He stopped dead in his tracks and stared at the brightly colored boxes of ice cream in awe. It had been years since he'd been in a grocery store, and he'd completely forgotten how nice they smelled. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps made him jump. Startled, he turned and saw a woman walking towards him. She was tall and thin with sharp elbows and an even sharper gaze. She walked right past Bob without even acknowledging his presence. Bob stared after her, unsure of what to do next. Taking a deep breath, Bob decided to make his way to the checkout line. As he shuffled along, he admired all the colorful packages surrounding him. He picked up a can of corn and examined it closely. It was the first time in years he'd actually seen a can of corn up close. He chuckled to himself. It was quite a funny-looking vegetable. At the checkout, Bob slid the can of corn across the conveyor belt and waited. The cashier was a young man with a bored expression on his face. He scanned the can of corn without even glancing at it. That'll be $1.27, he said without looking up. Bob stared at him in disbelief. He didn't have $1, let alone $1.27. What was he supposed to do? Was he really going to get arrested for stealing a can of corn? As the cashier began to remove the can from the conveyor belt, Bob panicked. He grabbed the can and shoved it back towards the scanner. Wait, he said, hoping that the cashier would understand that he wanted to pay for it. The cashier looked up at him, startled. What? He asked. Bob repeated, wait, louder this time. The cashier shook his head and started to speak, but Bob cut him off. Wait, 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 he insisted, gesturing wildly with his hands. The cashier sighed and put his head down. Bob knew that he wasn't getting through to the cashier, but he was determined to try anyway. He stood up on his tippy toes and yelled, "Wait, wait, wait, please wait." The cashier flinched and looked up at him, startled. "What?" he whispered. Bob pointed to the can of corn and then to himself. He took a deep breath and repeated, "Please, please, please wait." The cashier stared at him for a moment and then slowly reached out and grabbed the can of corn. He scanned it again and pushed it back towards Bob. Bob stared at the can in disbelief. Had he done it? Had he convinced the cashier to wait? As Bob made his way out of the store, he couldn't believe what had just happened. He'd managed to get a can of corn without being noticed. He felt a surge of pride and accomplishment. He clutched the can of corn tightly as he walked. For the first time in years, he felt like he was a part of something bigger than himself. He was on a mission and he wasn't going to let anyone stop him. When Bob returned to the base, he was greeted by a chorus of cheers. The minions had been waiting anxiously for his return and they were ecstatic to see that he had brought back the prize. Gru, who had been pacing back and forth, stopped and stared at Bob in disbelief. "You," he whispered, "you actually did it." Bob nodded shyly and clutched the can of corn tighter. "I couldn't have done it without you guys," he said. "We did it," corrected Gru, a wide grin spreading across his face. "We got the paper clip."